Welcome, everyone. This is Dick and Sharon here, again interviewing Bill Blum. Bill Blum is a former judge and death penalty defense attorney. He's the author of 3 legal thrillers published by Penguin Putnam: Prejudicial Error, The Last Appeal, and The Face of Justice. And he's a contributing writer for the California Lawyer magazine, as well as the Progressive and clearly the LA Progressive. Welcome, Bill. Nice to see you again.
Thanks. It's always great to be with you.
So today we're going to be talking about a piece that you contributed to the LA Progressive. And again, thank you. And it's such an important piece where you're talking about the new code of ethics that have been adopted by the United States Supreme Court, mind you, for the first time in American history. So can you tell us a little bit about what you wrote here and why this is important for people to know?
Sure. So on November 13, the United States Supreme Court, with all 9 justices concurring, adopted a code of ethics for the first time in its history. It's important because this is a first. It's also important because it shows that the court does respond to public pressure and public clamor for ethics reform. However, when you get into the details and you actually read the code, which is 14 pages long, including 5 pages of commentary that are appended to the code as an appendix, and the 1-page introduction, this is a code that really doesn't do much of anything. The court has already said that it abides by the principles that are embodied in this code, and there are basically 5 sections or 5 canons of ethics. So there isn't much new in it, but it isn't the same as the code of conduct that applies to lower court federal judges because there's no enforcement mechanism. And if you read the code of conduct for the U.S. Supreme Court carefully, it's really entirely voluntary with the justices. And that's clearest in the canon dealing with disqualification of the justices. You know from doing litigation that oftentimes there are challenges to judges on the basis of bias. And different court systems, state systems, and the federal system have ways of dealing with those sorts of claims. The Supreme Court's Code of Ethics says that a justice should disqualify himself or herself when there's a conflict of interest. The lower court code says a judge shall disqualify. So it's mandatory language. This is all voluntary on the part of the Supreme Court. And as I said, there's no mechanism for enforcement, whereas there are various methods to enforce ethics challenges for lower court judges. You can file an affidavit against a district court judge in many cases and remove a district court judge from hearing a case. You can file a formal motion for disqualification for a lower court judge, even for a court of appeal judge. And if that motion is denied, you can appeal the denial. In the Supreme Court, there's no way to appeal a denial of a motion for disqualification, and they are made in the Supreme Court because there's no higher court. So we're left with a code that some commentators, one of my favorites, Ian Millhiser from Vox, says is worse than nothing because it creates the illusion of progress where no progress has occurred. And it comes across as a kind of gaslighting to those who, like me, follow the court very carefully. So this is, in some ways, a small step forward, but mostly just a smokescreen to keep things the way that they are.
So there's been a lot of controversy around apparently unethical behavior by Justice Thomas and Alito, and there has been a lot of pressure on the Supreme Court. And what you're saying and what your article says and what others say is essentially the Supreme Court blew off the criticism. They're gaslighting. They put out a document that I think in the beginning of your article you call it a public relations ploy. Do you think there's any way that public opinion, congressional opinion, outrage could make them have real accountability?
Well, I do, but it's a slow process and it's a political process. There's no legal avenue at present to bring Supreme Court justices in line. There is a process for members of the public to file ethics complaints against federal judges, except Supreme Court justices. And sometimes those ethics complaints actually go places, but there isn't any avenue for that kind of relief now. So you need legislation, and legislation has been proposed. Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat for Rhode Island, in the Senate Judiciary Committee is sponsoring, along with others, a bill to increase transparency and ethics reform at the Supreme Court. It has Democratic support, but it's going to go nowhere because of the filibuster rule in the Senate. And of course, the House is controlled by Republicans. So this is really a political question, and ethics reform and the entire political jurisprudential trajectory of the Supreme Court has to be an issue in the upcoming election for people. And Democrats and others who are running as independents have to make that issue one of the most vital concerns for people who cast their ballots. And that's the only way this is going to happen. Should Democrats and progressives ever get control of Congress again and have a president willing to act, then I think we can make some real progress. But right now, the position of the Supreme Court, as stated by John Roberts over and over again, and more bluntly by Samuel Alito in his interviews with the Wall Street Journal in July, is that the Supreme Court is beyond the control of Congress. And they have a theory which says that the Supreme Court is an independent branch of government. It's the only court established explicitly by the Constitution, and therefore Congress can't regulate the Supreme Court. But that, it seems to me, is nonsense, because the constitutional design is set up in such a way that we have three co-equal branches of government which check and balance one another so that no single branch of government achieves supremacy. So again, I do think there are possibilities. We know what has to be done. And ultimately, if the Democrats and progressives ever got control of Congress and had a president willing to act, we could expand the Supreme Court. And I think that's really an item that we should hold as the gold standard of where we ought to go in the long run, because Supreme Court justices tend to serve a long, long time, whereas at one point in our history, they only served for maybe an average of 13 years. Now they're serving for more than 26 years. And Trump's appointees are all very young, and they're going to be serving Dick and Sharon and me long after we leave the scene. So we've got to do something to help the present generation and generations to come to have a court that's responsive to the changing needs of the country as it approaches the middle of the 21st century.
Well, sadly, the court's most recent decisions, specifically Dobbs, are the kinds of decisions that awaken the masses to the kind of power that the United States Supreme Court has. And perhaps, I think in my lifetime, I don't imagine that people really think very seriously about Supreme Court appointments when they're considering the presidential election. And perhaps this time they will think more carefully.
Well, Dobbs has really backfired on the Supreme Court. I look at the Supreme Court justices as politicians in black robes. If I were to write a bio of Samuel Alito, I would have a one-line sentence which says, Republican politician currently employed as a Supreme Court justice. And he knew exactly what he was doing in Dobbs. And after he wrote the Dobbs decision, not the leaked version, but the final version, he got an all-expenses-paid trip to Rome where he chortled about the decision and yucked it up with like-minded people. Another instance of alleged corruption on the court, and another reason for ethics reform. So I think Dobbs has driven people to vote, and I think it will be a good driver of the electorate in 2024. I don't know whether it will be enough.
Well, speaking of 2024, if it's not enough, what kinds of things are you thinking about?
Well, here's what I'm thinking of exploring. I think 2024, we say this with each election, that this election is the most important. And people may get tired of hearing that this election is the most important. You said that the last time. Well, it actually is true. Each successive election in the United States is the most important in our lifetimes, because the Republican Party has become a party of autocracy. It's become the party of Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump's reelected, then I think people on the left in the United States have to shift their thinking a little bit from how do we operate under a Democratic presidency, which is in some respects neoliberal and we don't like it, but we can see room for maneuvering, to how we resist a proto-fascist or neo-fascist government in the United States. I don't think that many of us are prepared for the challenge. And that's what I'm going to be looking into. And I'm going to be exploring how people on the left, say, for example, in Hungary, are managing to hang on, managing to publish opposition newspapers in the face of Orban's crackdown. They haven't done very well, but they are managing to resist to a certain extent. What can we learn from this? If our answer is that we're just going to file a bunch of lawsuits and rely on the ACLU and other legal organizations to save us, I'm afraid that's not going to be enough. So I don't have the answers, but I think we've got to start thinking along these lines. It's kind of like fighting a fire. You have an offensive stage and a defensive stage. If Trump's reelected and you look at Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for how he wants to transform the presidency into a presidential dictatorship, we've got to start thinking about how we are going to survive in that environment. And I think that that's something that, again, gets back to the Supreme Court, because I don't think we can rely on the Supreme Court alone to save us. The Supreme Court, in terms of Trump's election challenges, was pretty good, because those challenges were just so off the wall that they didn't appeal to anyone except Clarence Thomas and occasionally Alito. But things can really change on a dime. And that's what we have to be prepared for, and that's what we have to be thinking about, and that's what we have to be communicating to everyone that we can, including younger people who may not be acquainted with the history of the far right and how necessary it is to hang together rather than to divide ourselves.
Yeah, I think we Americans aren't fully aware of how grim it could be. I mean, so when Franco took over Spain and Perón took over Argentina, their right-wing grasp on the country lasted for decades.
That's right.
You know, it's not just one election, and then 4 years from now or 2 years from now we'll correct it. Especially with what Trump is putting together in the Heritage Foundation, a way to really disable our democracy in a real way.
That's right. In the United States, if you think about it, is a country, a constitutional democracy that has built-in mechanisms that allow for minority rule, from the Electoral College to the constitutional design of the Senate, which allocates 2 seats to each state, regardless of the population. We have a system that allows a minority to control the political direction of the country. And if you look at the Senate, the Supreme Court has 6 Republicans, even though 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, the Democrat has won the popular vote. So we have to be very careful. And I'm reminded, I'll disclose this one anecdote. I was in Berlin in 2019, I think it was, or 2018. And I went to the Jewish museum there, and the big exhibit was closed down. So I had to look at all these little exhibits. And one of the exhibits had a collection of artifacts from Holocaust victims, including letters. And one of the letters that I remember, I'll never forget it, was written by an educated Berliner to friends outside of Germany. And the writer said, "Don't worry about these brown shirts and Nazis. The rhetoric is really disturbing. But now that they have achieved some power, I think they'll calm down. They'll realize the responsibilities of wielding power and don't worry about me and our family members who are still here in Germany. Of course, that writer perished in the death camps. So we really do have to take this seriously. America is not exceptional in so many ways. It's not exceptional. We're raised on the belief that it is. And we are just as susceptible to far-right takeover as any other country in the world. And we're seeing it unfold right now before our eyes. And it's time we start thinking about it.
You know, as a Black person, I never believed that America was exceptional. But I think that what I suffer from, a lot of Black people suffer from, and that is we don't really have a lot of confidence in any of our systems. So I don't think that we've really maximized the use of our systems. Like when I look at, when they talk about the Supreme Court trailblazing decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, I just simply go and look at the schools today. They are just as segregated today as they were back then. So I don't really look to the systems to protect us, and that includes the EEOC. We have so much discrimination in employment and housing and all of those really unbelievable, all the work that went into the civil rights movement in 1960, the Voting Rights Act, which has now been undone, all of that stuff. I just don't have any confidence. So what I think of today is how can we not only energize young people and educate them about how potentially volatile our current situation is, but how do you get people who have no confidence in the system, and I'm one of them, to believe that we can actually use the system to protect ourselves?
Well, one of the things I think we need to do is that we're all operating within the system to some extent. Anything we do, we're in the same space as other people are, but I don't think we need to rely solely on governmental institutions. I think we have a revived labor movement, which could be a real key. And it's just very multifaceted. And we have to look at how we built movements like the old anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, because it's really the pressure from without, outside of government that really results in big changes. But so you have to do two things at the same time, many things at the same time. And it's an ongoing struggle, and it's complicated now and made more urgent by climate change. Back in the 1960s, I mean, things were really depressing in many, many ways. The level of political violence was as bad, if not worse, then than it is now. But there was also a sense of optimism back then, as I think back at that the left was ascendant. Now we're living in a world where the right is ascendant. And in the old days, we didn't have the specter of climate change hanging over us. So what that means to me is that we have less time to act than we did in the past to make the world better for the average person, for most people, for the vast majority. But and we can each only do so much individually. And I tried very hard to warn people about Donald Trump and the rise of neo-fascism, dating back to 2015. I was one of the very first to do that. And it was hard for me to get articles published about it because people thought I was being alarmist. And now it seems like I wasn't being alarming enough. So the next stage is to get people to start thinking, how are you going to exist in a second Trump term? Yeah. And that's a question that we all have to start thinking about. You know, where people are starting to think, well, what if I vote for Cornel West or Jill Stein or Robert Kennedy Jr.? You know, those are all questions that I think are legitimate, but they're not going to win. So what are you going to do with your politics and your own personal safety and your family if Trump gets a second shot? Because the second shot's going to be a lot worse than the first.
Absolutely. And the Democratic Party has a price to pay, because I think that their lack of proactivity, particularly around lots of things like the Voting Rights Act, the stripping away of the Voting Rights Act. Come on, the Democratic Party knew that was going to happen. They were working towards that. Far right, they've been working towards that really since the Powell memo. So anyway, It's
But
always
you-
such a
but you-
pleasure.
But you do point
It's
out,
always
I mean, there are good signs. I mean, there is a revived women's rights movement, thanks to Dobbs. There's one labor success after another
That's true.
recently.
That's true.
And you're right, it's oftentimes not working through government. It's working through outside movements that have changed the country. And so it's hard, if you don't have a seat in Congress, it's hard to influence the Congress. But you can always join your local Planned Parenthood organization or support your labor union. And that's the way people can express their deep concern about the direction of the country.
Yeah, and I don't want to minimize the importance of legal action either, like the ACLU undertakes, because it's tremendously important. But I don't think we're going to litigate our way out of fascism.
Right.
And we have to understand that.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Well, Bill Blum, it's been a great, another great conversation with you. I look forward to reading about the research that you're doing. I think it's really important for us to prepare for the worst. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but we certainly should be prepared.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Same here. Okay, till next time.
Okay, till next time. Thanks.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.